Hello everybody and welcome to this screencast for GCSE English. This one is on how to approach paper 2 and it's going to be focusing specifically on how we answer questions 1, 2 and 3. So some reminders about the exam paper itself. First of all, it's worth more marks than paper 1, so it's out of 96, and it is a little bit longer as an exam, but it's not as much longer as you might think, bearing in mind how many more marks it's worth. So you do actually have quite a lot less time to spend on each question in paper 2 compared to paper 1. Like paper 1 though, section A assesses you for reading, section B assesses you for writing. So there are two ways that this paper particularly is different to paper 1. For a start, there are 2 texts to read instead of 1, and they will both be non-fiction texts. And the final 2 questions for section A are comparative, asking you to compare those 2 texts. So let's talk next about strategy and timings for this paper. Whereas with paper 1 we were going to say we were going to spend 2 minutes a mark on each question, for paper 2 it's only 1 minute a mark. So if a question is worth 15 marks, you're going to spend 15 minutes on it. Now, as well as that time for answering the questions, we're suggesting allow yourself 10 to 15 minutes to read both of the texts that they've given you. Just as with paper 1, let's read the questions first. And we're going to divide section A into 2 parts, handling questions 1 to 3 separately to questions 4 to question 7b, which we suggest you also follow when you're doing the exam. So, as suggested, let's start by reading questions 1, 2 and 3. So this is what this exam paper looks like, and you can see that questions 1 and 2 are short answer questions, but question 3 is the language and structure question worth 15 marks. So just as we did for paper 1, we're going to start by circling the key line numbers referred to in the questions and the key things that you're being asked to look for in the questions. So you can see here that I've already done that. You can see I've circled for question 1 lines 11 to 16, for question 2 lines 27 to 28, and for each of the questions the key things that we're being asked to look out for. And then on my actual text, remember we haven't even read the text yet, you can see here, just like with paper 1, I've bracketed off the key lines for each question, labelled the brackets with the number of the question referred to, and made a brief note for myself what it is that I'm looking out for. And then it's time to read text 1. Now, as we said before with timings, we're suggesting that we spend 2 minutes on question 1 because it's worth 2 marks, 2 minutes on question 2 for the same reason, and 15 minutes on question 3. So let's look at questions 1 and 2, which are more straightforward, aren't they? And you can see, here's an example of some answers to these questions, that you literally for question 1 just have to pull out 2 items, 2 key things from those lines. We should all be getting that right. That's pretty easy. So that's basically just testing your ability to read, your comprehension skills. Question 2, a little bit different. It's asking for a quote, so one example from lines 22 to 28, and then it's asking you to explain how that quote, in this case, shows the writer's feelings for his new wife. So you see you get 1 mark for the example, so my example is my little darling, and you get 1 mark for explaining how the writer uses language. So I've said that darling is an affectionate form of address and little makes him sound protective of her. You have to do both the quote and the explanation to get the 2 marks. Right, question 3, of course, just as it is in paper 1, will always be about language and structure. Now, can you remember what counts for language and what counts for structure? You might want to pause the screencast for a moment and see whether you can remember before I fill in some of those gaps. So here we have the key things that we could include for language. And here we have the key things that we could include for structure. Just like with paper 1, you have to write about language and structure. and again your mark gets capped this time at 6 out of 15 if you don't do both of those. Now you might have noticed here that the differences between levels 3, 4 and 5 are the words explanation, exploration and analysis. I just want to talk briefly about the difference between these three words. Essentially, the more you're thinking about the text for yourself and the more specific your comments about the text are, and the more confident you are about breaking down the language that has been used and analysing it, the more you're getting closer to analysis and further away from explanation, which is a more straightforward sort of stating of what's happening in the text. So obviously we're all aiming for analysis and we go via exploration, and I would say the key thing about being able to explore a text is having the confidence to start thinking about it for yourself and breaking it down into smaller parts. So let's look at some of the things that we might say when thinking about language and structure for this text. So you can see here that I've made some notes, and these are going to scatter around the sheet on post-its about the sort of things that we might say. The first comment here is for language. It's about word choice, and it's about the fact that his use of words and phrases like darling, my little darling, darling itself is repeated 5 times, shows Bailey's affection and love for his wife. So that's one point we could make for language. Another point we could make for language is about the tone of the letter, actually. This is a very sort of informal and warm tone, and we see that partly through the use of colloquial language that the writer uses. So, for example, slosh, A1 and twaddle. Now, a point for structure that we could make is on the use of lists, especially in that second paragraph there. And in this paragraph, he is basically listing all of the items that his wife has sent him in his latest package and distinguishing between the ones that he wants next time and the ones that he doesn't. So the use of those lists helps him to convey that detail without confusing the reader. And then another point on structure that we can include is the use of rhetorical questions in the text. I think there are 2 or 3 in there. Now obviously the audience for this text originally was the writer's wife, so he didn't write it for us to study in a GCSE exam. It was a very private audience, and we could say that the use of those rhetorical questions helps her feel involved and helps to structure the letter as a conversation between him and her rather than a piece of one-way dialogue. Now here's the mark scheme that the board have created for this paper and for this question. So you can see here all of the different sorts of examples that could be included for language and then for structure. And of course the examiners are told to credit any reasonable response that you make, so you might come up with some ideas that aren't included here, and as long as they show that you're thinking about the text and they're accurate, you will be credited for them. So, in order to move from explain to explore to analyse, one of the key things we need to do is write in fully developed P paragraphs, okay? And it's that A of the P which helps shift us up from explain towards analysis. So here, these are the parts that are colour-coded green. So I've modelled here a P paragraph for one of those key points, the first one about Bailey's use of word choice. And I'm going to give you a little bit of time to read that now, and you can see that the red is the evidence, the purple is the point, and the green is the analysis. So I'm going to give you a few seconds to read that. Now, if you wanted to, and you wanted to practice writing P paragraphs yourself, here's an opportunity. You can pause the screencast in a moment, choose one or more of these points that you could then turn into a fully developed P paragraph. Okay, and if you do that, then I suggest that once you've written the paragraph, you go back and section off the different parts of the paragraph or colour code it in a certain way, to check that you've used all 3 parts of the paragraph. Okay, so that's it for questions 1, 2 and 3. So some reminders before we finish. You've got half as much time per question compared to section A in paper 1. So it's really important that we get clear in our heads that there is quite a big difference in terms of timing between paper 1 and paper 2. Just as with paper 1 though, we're suggesting that you read the questions first, but for paper 2, read questions 1 to 3 and then read text 1, and then as you'll see in the second screencast, read questions 4 to 7b and then read text 2. For question 3, make sure you comment on language and structure. Okay, remember that you can't even get half marks if you only answer on one of those. And in order to move from explanation to analysis, let's try and make sure that we're writing as developed P paragraphs as we can. Okay, that's it for the first screencast.